crisis is.
Sorry about that.
Got it.
Yes.
And I said, if we cannot, but if we allow some demonstrators to rip signs or flags out of the hands of other demonstrators, we're no better than the people we're demonstrating against. And if that's the case, maybe some of us will have to start calling to boycott the demonstrations. That message did get through. And today, in fact, for the most part, the messaging from the podium continues to be focusing on the judicial overthrow. But in many of the cities, there is a very visible presence of what we call the Gush Neged Kibush, the anti-occupation bloc, including people from most of the human rights organizations. But, Rabbi Ike asked me before we started, are the demonstrators who are out there really concerned with democracy for everybody? And the answer, unfortunately, is that there are many who are, at the end of the day, only concerned about democracy for Jews. And just as Martin Luther King said that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere, the lack of democracy anywhere is a threat to democracy everywhere. We can no longer call ourselves a democracy when, through a tyranny of the majority. By the way, that is the argument of those for judicial overthrow, is that the judiciary should be a carbon copy of the Knesset. It should reflect percentage-wise what the opinions are among all the citizens. And of course, judges need to respect citizens. But the whole idea of checks and balances is that the judiciary has to be able to stand against the tyranny of the majority, particularly for the rights of minorities. And so we need a judiciary that will champion LGBTQ rights. We need a judiciary that will champion rights for Reform Judaism and other non-Orthodox religious Jews. We work on behalf of the Bedouin in the Negev. Citizens for many of their villages are unrecognized, meaning they don't exist. Once, when a road was going to go through one of them, the government said, what village? There's no village there, even though they were there before the state of Israel or where we moved them. Citizens. And in the occupied territories, and again, do we have a democracy when some people live in such, Israeli Jews, in such poverty that the struggle for even daily existence really doesn't allow them to participate in the democratic process? In the occupied territories, international law does not outlaw occupation. It regulates it. But when the laws of occupation were written in the Hague Conventions and then the Fourth Geneva Convention, nobody imagined a 55-year plus occupation. It's a lacuna in international law. It was never addressed. And if we can say that for a year or 2 years or 5 years, there's a lack of full freedom and democracy, and it's temporary, you can't say that anymore after 55 years. People that do not vote for the Knesset, that determines their fate, they are not judges on the courts they can go to. They don't serve on the committees. We've abolished their committees for planning and zoning and created our own that generally don't allow them to build legally. And then when they build without a permit, demolish the homes. You could say, well, duh, they're an enemy population. Of course, they're not going to be, they can't be voting in our society. The idea of international law is that you even the playing field of it, you put some limits on national sovereignty to protect the population, but we don't recognize that either. So it's nishta here, nishta here. People are just left without any protection. But as I said, every crisis is an opportunity. We now have an opportunity that people in the streets to talk to people that didn't think about these things. Just a couple of years ago, when in the previous Netanyahu government, for over a year, there were people camping outside his house. One of our employees took time off to be living out there, basically. He didn't believe himself that he was rubbing shoulders with all these former generals and colonels and this kind of stuff, who weren't really thinking about issues of occupation. He brought some of them out, and some of them today have become anti-occupation activists. People who were senior army officials. Every crisis is an opportunity. So that is one thing that did shock many Israelis, including many right-wing Israelis and settlers to the core, was the Hawara pogrom.
Can you say that again?
One thing that has shocked many Israelis, including unlikely suspects from the right-wing settlers, was the Hawara pogrom. If you're all familiar, just a few weeks ago, it was a real Had Gadya moment. You have the army went in to one of the Palestinian towns to arrest wanted terrorists. In the process, they killed also women and children. A few days after that, you have a terror attack in which 2 Israelis were murdered. And then that night, 400 settlers went on a rampage in the village of Hawara, burning, destroying. It's a miracle that that people got out of their burning homes alive and that more people didn't die. And our top army brass used the word the next day, pogrom. That's what it was. There's no other word. And at 11 o'clock that night, after this has been raging for 5 hours, I called the command center. What are you guys doing? And I wasn't taught, the person I was speaking to wasn't making the decisions, but she said, it's a balagan out there. It's a mess out there, and there's nothing we can do. And I said to her, if Palestinians were attacking a Jewish community, you would never dare dream to say there's nothing we could do. It just could not happen. And all too many times, unfortunately though, I've seen where settlers have been coming to burn Palestinian fields. We call the police the army. And they end up shooting tear gas at the Palestinians trying to put out the fires in their fields or trees. A few months ago, part of our work is we try to defend Palestinian shepherds. If you're a shepherd and you're living on the edge to begin with, between feeding your flocks through bought feed and through grazing, when settlers or the army, whoever prevents you from getting to your fields, it can become economically no longer viable. And unfortunately, some people just sell their flocks and give up. Thank God, because we accompany these people every day, many are hanging on. But 2 years ago, in February, Zev Hefer, a main strategist and ideologue and convicted terrorist for the settler movement, head of one of the major settler organizations today, Amana, said in a conference, we have set up over 30 shepherding outposts. And we're going to set up more because it's even more effective than anything else in taking over Palestinian land and holding on to it. You have the flocks going far and wide, pushing out the Palestinian shepherds from the same lands and destroying everything that they own. So one day I catch one of these flocks in a gated-in Palestinian olive grove. We call the police, the army, they don't really show up. The landowner gets a bit angry. He slams the gate shut as the settler is trying to leave to keep him in there, so maybe the police will arrive. It might have slightly nicked him, the settler. He calls the police and the army, they show up in a second. Ambulances, a medic, he's not injured. I eventually get detained for a few hours because they say I attacked somebody, which of course I hadn't. The next day, the same officer was there, invites me to video him. And he says, without any compunction, without any embarrassment, that settler in a Palestinian olive grove is not my business. You are the problem. I'm the problem. Why? Because if you were not here, the Palestinians would not dare to come to their lands and harass the poor settlers who are trespassing on their lands. That's literally what he said. So it remains to be seen whether the shock that was felt by this Hawara pogrom will be remembered or forgotten as we move on. But just maybe the shock that was so widespread means that out of the burning flames of those buildings, a candle of hope was lit. And remember the words of Rabbi Salanter, founder of the Musar movement. He once went by and saw a cobbler working late at the night by a sputtering candle. And he said, why are you working so late? He says, as long as the candle is lit, I can fix things. And Salanter took that as a message for life. As long as there's a light lit, we can still fix things. So I'm going to briefly, I want to leave some time for discussion, debate, arguments, whatever, questions. I basically believe that there are 5 things that we need to be doing right now. First of all, those of us in the human rights community have to put ourselves in more danger than we already have. And again, I've been attacked and injured many times. I'm lucky to be here. First of all, with Itamar Ben-Gvir as our police minister, and you all know that as a quid pro quo for agreeing to the delay, he's demanded his private militia. And that's terrifying. It's terrifying that we're going to have our own Proud Boys. And that's one of the reasons, by the way, that there's also now a huge debate within the protest movement. I'm one of the people that says, with all the dangers of co-optation, what will happen now that there's discussions, you can't not talk. We have to talk, and we just have to keep on demonstrating. I was very pleased to see that there were still hundreds of thousands of Israelis in the streets last night From here, I'll be going back to Evanston for a local demonstration. And we have to keep the feet to the fire of the people that are negotiating. Others say it's a total trap. Look at this militia, look at the fact that the most egregious of all the potential bills has already been tabled to give the government total control over selection of judges, which means that at any time in a matter of hours, a vote could be called. Even during the Passover recess, the Knesset could be called back into session. And they say it's a trap. I think we do have to talk. But in that situation, it's going to be more dangerous. And when I think about the gatekeepers that keep us from getting to our fellow Israelis sometimes, and one of the reasons I am still doing this after 27 years is because of after all that I've seen, all the injustice and evil that I've seen, I still believe in the basic goodness and decency of my fellow Israelis. If I didn't believe in that, I think I would have been out of there a long time ago. So, with the exception of something like the Hawara pogrom, if Palestinians are attacked, it almost never gets into the press. They're one of the gatekeepers. But when we're attacked, sometimes it gets in the press and maybe some people start to think about where we're going. We have to do more civil disobedience. And frankly, in the WhatsApp groups and the discussions among the protest organizers, I've opposed blocking roads. God forbid that an ambulance has to get through and somebody dies. The civil disobedience I believe in is blocking the people that are coming to do a human rights violation. So I've been on trial for standing in front of bulldozers coming to demolish Palestinian homes. And recently, in October, for example, one of the more violent settlers was from one of these shepherding outposts, was racing his pickup to run into a Palestinian flock, as he often does. I and another person, we managed to get on either side of his pickup and stop him. He gets out, we stand between him and the shepherdess and her flock. And then he picks up this huge rock. And then I did something that was illegal. I bear hugged him. Even though we'd called the police and they hadn't showed up, even though he was about to use that rock, it was illegal for me to have physical contact with him. I put on Facebook later all the pictures, the video. I said, police, you've wanted to get me for a long time. Here is your chance. Arrest me, indict me. I'll help you because you're gatekeepers and you close every single case. Violent people are encouraged because they know they won't pay a price. I want to get by you and talk about the hundreds of cases that I have documented where you didn't do anything to stop Palestinian settler flocks from destroying Palestinian lands. I want to talk about all the cases of violence you didn't deal with. They didn't arrest me then, but just a few weeks ago, I was accompanying Palestinian landowners to submit complaints. They sent them home, and they said, we have to interrogate you. I said, thank you. Just tell me what to do. Help me let you indict me. We'll see what happens. We have to do more creative legal work. There are a lot of things we haven't tried. Restraining orders, civilian suing for damages, going to the high court perhaps about all the cases that were never properly investigated or dealt with. You know, for almost a year, I was speaking with a senior advisor to the previous police minister who agreed with me that the police should be keeping settler flocks out of land, which according to Israeli maps belongs to Palestinians. Do you think it happened? She thought she had an agreement with the police in the occupied territories. No. The fourth thing involves you, and this for some of you will be difficult. We need more international concern. I know and understand the reticence, but there are communities like Susia, villages like Susia and Khan al-Ahmar, which are only standing because of international pressure. And when we have people like Itamar Ben-Gvir and Bezalel Smotrich, and others who say we can ignore the international community. And when there's been now some change in the Biden administration, a lot of people last night in Tel Aviv were waving American flags in appreciation of some of the remarks that President Biden made last week. For the most part, the Biden administration has also chosen to remain relatively disengaged. And we need people who care about Israel, not the people that want to sell Israel down the river. People who care about Israel to be lobbying the US administration. Friends, don't let friends drive drunk. For Israel's own good, for the sake of our most basic values. Don't cut off Israel, but use your influence for these basic issues of justice, which are ultimately also in Israel's interest. And finally, I really commend, for those of you who can get through the firewalls and get to English Haaretz, and I might have a few copies here. This Friday after our elections, there was an article by Anshel Pfeffer in English Haaretz. He said, we talk about Israel as a Jewish and a democratic state, but most of us in the human rights community, the progressives, we really only talk about democracy. And that's maybe obvious, because as progressives, we understand it's not just an in-house Jewish conversation. We have non-Jewish citizens. We have people who are under our control who are not Jewish. But if you analyze demographically, the people that are moving further and further to the right, maybe even leaving the ultra-Orthodox parties to vote for Ben-Gvir, they are generally traditional or Orthodox. Many of them, unfortunately, do not respond to the arguments in the language of democracy, and we're going to have to speak to them Jewish. That's another thing that we're going to have to do. So those are some of the 5 points. I want to stop here. We have another 20 minutes or so for discussion, comments, and I even encourage arguments. People, if there's something you disagree with, please be, open and give me a chance to respond. And when we finish, if there are people who are not on our mailing list that would like to be, maybe we can have a sign-up sheet or something like that. But yeah, see you later. Okay, please. Yes.
Okay, so we have to use the microphone and hopefully people on this one.
Okay.
I understand they were discussing militia.
Yes.
You know what sounds like?
I have not checked this morning yet. I can't give you an answer. You're correct. It was supposed to be discussed in the cabinet meeting today, and I could try to take a quick look, but I don't know yet. I know that this idea of the militia was already in the coalition agreements. It's just now being fast-tracked a little bit more. But I'm sure if you look at any of the Israeli papers and probably some of the US media outlets, you can get, for example, into Times of Israel without a firewall, or 972. Okay, so there. All right, so there are other places, and I'm sure it'll all be reported. Yeah, no, there were no reports. Okay, well, I'm sure we'll hear soon. Yeah.
Can you come up here? Right here, so that, because there's another 20 people there, and then hold this. There you go.
Hi, Kit. Hi, Maddie. This is probably not your area of expertise, but you mentioned that. It's just dawning on the Israeli government, like the plagues, that this is serious and they should realize the road they're going down. To me, there's an obvious parallel And it's right here in the United States. And you see what's happening and you'd say, how could they keep saying what they're doing and trying to have states taking over the selection of electors and things like that? Are they just doing this independently? It's going on all over the world, or does one look at the other and saying, this is the way to get our way, get our way?
Well, you know that former President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu are very close. I do think, I don't know what's the chicken, what's the egg. It does certainly seem that they exchange playbooks every once in a while. And as you suggested, it's not just the United States or Israel. You look at what's happening in Hungary, Poland, India, what was the case for a long time in Brazil, and so on and so forth. One difference is, though, up till now, the potential threat to democracy in this country has not caused investors to flee or people to refuse to serve in the army or these kinds of things so far. Whether that will happen, I don't know. But in Israel, many just feel that a basic contract between the government and its citizens is being violated. It was also very interesting to hear, if some of you saw the recap of David Grossman's remarks at the Jerusalem protest last night. One of the things that's amazing is that this has woken up a kind of silent, passive, it's probably the majority, although we're very closely divided. And, he said, part of the triumphalism of the Orthodox world is saying, we have a full wagon of values and principles and ethics, and the secular people have an empty wagon. Of course, we as religious non-Orthodox Jews are not exactly there, but said this waking up is about the fact that also the secular Israelis do have values and principles. And of course, and as I said, they've also been joined by many people who are Orthodox. And but yes, there are some frightening similarities for sure.
We have a question on Zoom. Alice, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Rabbi. I've really enjoyed your talk. My question is, and I agree, I don't know his name, with the other questioner about how there are a lot of issues in the United States that, that are similar to what's going on in Israel. I often in the last few weeks have said, why does the minority in our country have so much more control than the majority? But that's not my question. My question is, do you think the fact that Israel's government does not have a foundational constitution contributes to the issues that are currently going on?
First of all, in terms of the first part of what you said and connecting to the previous, it's also important to remember, and I say this as someone who has dedicated my life to all these human rights violations and injustices, which did not just start with this government, that it's not just Israel. And Israel is far from being the worst human rights violator in the world, but it's our country and our values at test. And that's, but in terms of, again, the question, I'm sorry, your question was, then the second part was?
The second part was, do you think some of the issues about that there's no constitution?
In our Declaration of Independence, it was, which fascinatingly actually has legal weight today in lieu of a constitution, we said that within a certain number of months, we would create a constitution. And that never happened, partly because of the divisions then, and because frankly, David Ben-Gurion was a centralist. He was happy to keep that power in his hands. It's been discussed over the years many times. Part of President Herzog's proposals that were shot down within 15 minutes was that there should be a Bill of Rights. And if there would be a strong Bill of Rights, that would alleviate many of our concerns, because there would be certain things that the judges would also be beholden to, theoretically. Serious question. And I just saw an op-ed in the New York Times that somebody shared with me from yesterday or the day before from Yuval Levin, or Friday, I guess, saying that we should create a constitutional committee and work as not of the politicians themselves, and create a suggested constitution as soon as possible. It would be very helpful, and I don't see it happening.
Thank you.
People are, everyone is so ensconced in their victimhood. And remember also the people that are pushing this, they believe that they've been terribly mistreated by the high courts. And I think it's a total exaggeration, but that's the way they feel.
Thank you.
Other questions?
Yes.
Rabbi, my name is Todd Rosenberg. A question for you about the role of orthodoxy versus non-orthodoxy in this whole debate. There's a general idea in orthodoxy that the purpose of the state of Israel is to set up a state that supports Jewish law. And a number of those groups view secular states and secular institutions as an impediment to establishing that type of a state. To what degree does that play a role in this whole situation going on? Because that group is still going to be a minority group within the state of Israel.
Very good question. I've been reading slowly through a book by Michael Mankin, which I understand is now going to be translated into English, where he's part of an exciting new movement that I'm also trying to be a part of. It's called the Small Emuni, Progressives of Faith. And in his book, he writes extensively about the relationship between the Orthodox and the state. And of course, many of us have heard about how the first chief rabbi, Rabbi Kook, spoke about how secular Jews are doing God's work, and therefore we can work together with them. Some have suggested that he and others ultimately thought that this was the secular Jews were the Messiah's donkey that the Orthodox would ride into eventually. And there were all kinds of debates among the Orthodox. How can we support this state, which is not a halakhic state, which is not being run according to Orthodox law? And President Herzog's grandfather, Rabbi Herzog, who was also a chief rabbi of Israel, he basically said, many people say that he was the person that was tasked to address this, and how we can and can from a halakhic point of view, can Israel be a democracy? Can a Jewish state give the vote to non-Jews? And although he is credited with having made the case if you read what he says, he actually says that on the one hand, we have to support the state because it is what we call Israel in our prayers, Rishit Tzmichat Gulatenu. It's the beginning of the sprouting of our redemption. It's not the end. It's just the first step. And in today's reality in the world, Yad Israel lo chazakah. We do not have the power to institute a halakhic state in which only Jews would vote and maybe only, Rabbi Cook said only men should vote, and what have you. So the things we're seeing today, certainly in the thinking of Bezalel Smotrich, are an outgrowth of that. The national religious, people, some ultra Orthodox don't they play this game. They say on the one hand, they don't recognize the legitimacy of a non-halakhic Jewish state, but are finding all kinds of ways so that it can still be part of it so that they get funds and everything else. The national religious have foursquare supported the state in almost everything. But at some level, it was biding time until what really should happen could happen. And someone like Bezalel Smotrich believes the time has come. Others may, so that's the answer. Many people within the national religious parties, not all, there are many people with whom I feel very close and we share values. And I said already, our battle right now is to bring our case from a Jewish point of view to those populations. But many, basing themselves on even President Herzog's grandfather, think that when the time is right, things will look very different. Maybe, and as I said, some of them thinking time is right now. Yes.
Kol hakavod, Rabbi. This week is such an important week to us as Jews. And I imagine all of us will be at a Seder or two. This is our opportunity. We'll have an audience in front of us. We are obligated to repeat the things we've heard today and to discuss this problem that's going on in Israel today. These people out in the streets, they're protesting, are our Maccabees. They are the heroes. We have to support them. So use your voices, those of us on this call. And when you have a chance at the Seder, talk to the children, to the adults, to everyone, and make them know that this is the time to act. Talk to your representatives, to your state senators, your congressmen. And if we're here today and we have heard this, we have the message. Carry on.
I have one question. I was recently at a conference, ICON, 500 Israel educators, and we heard from Ben-Gurion's grandson, Yariv, and they asked him, what would Ben-Gurion think about what's happening in the streets? This was just 2 weeks ago. And his grandson said he would go back to his grave. They then interviewed the grandson of Rabbi Wolf Gold. Both of these, so Ben-Gurion and Gold signed the Declaration of Independence. They said to Gold, what would your grandfather say? And he said he would be ecstatic. He would love everything that's going on. There was some disagreement in the crowd because it's a bunch of Jewish educators. But the further question was, do you think that these two sides can reconcile and can talk to each other? And that's my question for you.
Okay, first of all, regarding the comment, we send out Passover supplements to the God every year, and somehow maybe on the plane, I'll edit stuff and send it out before Passover. But as I was even thinking this morning about what kinds of supplements I would like to provide, usually what we do every year is we send out something, who sits on our Seder, with a empty chair for various different victims of human rights violations. I was thinking this year, the question is, why is this Seder night different than any other Seder night? And how is it the same? It's different for the reasons that you elucidated, that we are only going to get through this, and that gets also to your question, if we're in it together. Often when people ask me, why do I continue to risk myself? Why do I continue to sometimes get beat up or whatever? And one of the answers I often give is what the Pirkei Avot, which we will start reading between Passover and Shavuot, some to Rosh Hashanah, and we read, "B'makom she'ein anashim yishtadel liot ish." When nobody is acting with basic human decency, you have to be the person that does. But if I were to revise that, I would revise it to not in the singular, but in the plural. We have to do it together. Here and there, and all of us together. That's the only way that we'll be able to get through this. And I don't know. Divides seem so immense. In some ways, actually, I think that Jabotinsky and Begin might have been more with the protesters than Ben-Gurion. As I said, he was a centralist in many ways. We've always been a divided society. It seems like we're more divided than ever before. It sometimes seems insurmountable. I only know that we have to try. And I will add something else, which I think is relevant. Many of the people that we work with defending their Israeli Jews, that we're defending the right to public housing, are in no way with us when it comes to issues of Palestinians. But of course, if we truly believe that every human being is created in God's image, and that gives everybody basic human rights, you can't condition your willingness to help somebody if they sign on the dotted line that they agree with you on everything. But a number of years ago, we had created a housing action group in Beit Sha'an, which is a very right-wing community. And one of the people came to us one day and said, my friends, I was saying, how are you working with those people? They help Palestinians. I said, but they help us too. They care about us also. It's the same lesson in this country. There are certain things that the Trump base say, misogyny, homophobia, we cannot support. But they do have to see us, not just with words, but with actions, fighting for the rights when middle-class people are concerned about putting food on the table. If there's any chance of bridging these gaps, it does include speaking Jewish to people, for that's the language they can understand. And it means, as we say, lo midrash ikar ela maaseh. It's not just, you can't just talk the talk, you have to walk the walk. And that means people have to see us with them. Same thing with Palestinians. How many Palestinian parents have told me, we want our children to meet you. My 10-year-old son wants to grow up and be a terrorist because he's seen this and that and the other thing happen to him. We want him to understand that not every Israeli comes with guns to demolish our homes or uproot our trees or steal our land. If there's a way out of it, it's being there. Looks like we're about time we have to finish. So I want to conclude. And some of you have heard me say, if you've heard me before, I always conclude with this idea that to be an activist, you have to have a predilection for beating your head against the wall. But every once in a while, the wall breaks. I've seen it in my life. And we have this amazing image in the Talmud of looking at all of life as two perfectly balanced scales. And you never know what little act that you take seems meaningless, pointless, irrelevant, ineffective at the time, whether that little thing will be the thing that tips those scales one way or the other. It's a burden of sorts because we can't just take time off, but it's also the hope. And what is it? And he started out at the outset by talking about counting the Omer, which we start doing the night after Seder night for 50 days until we get to Shavuot, to Mount Sinai. When God first speaks to Moses to send Moses to Egypt, he says, and I will bring you back here to this mountain. And here's where you're going to receive the worship me, where we'll receive the 10 Commandments. We say in the Talmud, one of the names of Shavuot, the anniversary of receiving the law, is at Seret Pesach, the conclusion of Passover. It's a process. And Rabbi Hirsch, who I quoted earlier, he says the following. Why, for most people, he's a little bit ethnocentric, the goal, the ultimate goal is independence. And once you've achieved that, there's nothing left to achieve. You've made it. You've reached your national aspirations. Why do we start counting the day after the Seder, the first Seder, the day after we've celebrated our freedom? And that's another thing, of course. There has to be a lot of discussion this year about what is freedom and what kind of freedom, and can we be free if everybody isn't free? And he says, the message is, when everybody else stops counting, we begin. Our counting has just started. It is terribly, terribly difficult that I've been doing this for 27 years. My beard was red when I started. Dealing day in and day out with the deepest, darkest corners of the country that I love, that I chose to live in, to raise a family. Every time we don't live up to our Jewish values, that's a moral outrage. But the greater tragedy is if we were to forget or give up that we're on the road to Sinai. We're taught Ein Mukdam Ein Muchar b'Torah. There's no thing that's no chronological order in the Torah. And today we've returned to the land of Israel, but we haven't reached Sinai yet, and we have to be on the way. So that's my prayer and wish and blessing for all of us. We should have courage and faith and wisdom to tip those scales in the right direction. Not give up on our people, not give up on Israel, not give up on God, not give up on ourselves, but with our eyes on the prize, keep heading to Sinai. Thank you.
Thank you so much. At Macomb Sola Lakeside, we have plenty of ways for you to go kadima, to go forward. We have some people from our Israel trip here. We're collecting cereal boxes. Our Tikkun Olam committee continues to meet. And thank you for giving us the hope for continuing on this path. And we'll see everyone. If you have a question, you can always come find me. We're off next week, and in 2 weeks, it's the Sunday before Yom HaShoah, and we have a Holocaust speaker, so a survivor. So we'll see everybody in 2 weeks.
Anybody that would like to know this, you can get card now, I'll be in touch with the office and. We'll get it done. Here.